used to work night shifts at a hospital. I was always fine with the odd hours. In fact, I enjoyed the peace and quiet that came with it. You could hear your own thoughts in those dark hours, and most of the time the patients were asleep, so there was very little to do. But one night changed everything. It was a slow Thursday night, nothing unusual. I was assigned to the third floor, where most of the terminally ill patients were kept. I had been on this floor countless times before. The atmosphere there always felt a little heavier, but it came with the territory. People came here to say goodbye. Around midnight, I went on my usual rounds. The hallways were empty, and the only sounds were the faint hum of the machines and the occasional beep from a heart monitor. I remember the sterile smell of antiseptic lingering in the air, clinging to my scrubs. That's when I noticed a nurse I hadn't seen before. She was standing at the far end of the hallway near room 307, staring into one of the rooms. I couldn't see her face very well, but something about her immediately made me uneasy. She was incredibly pale, almost like she was sick herself. Her uniform was strange too, white and old-fashioned, like something out of a different time period. The hospital had switched to blue scrubs years ago. I approached her slowly, thinking she must be new. Maybe she had transferred from another hospital, or she could have been a floater brought in to cover shifts. "Hey there, do you need help with anything?" I called out as I got closer, but she didn't respond. She just kept staring into the room. When I finally got close enough to see her face, a chill ran down my spine. Her eyes were wide, almost too wide, and her lips were thin, pressed into a tight smile that didn't seem natural. She turned to look at me for a split second before silently walking into the room she had been watching. Room 307. I stood there for a moment, frozen. My stomach twisted. Something about her just felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off, but I convinced myself I was just tired. Long shifts can play tricks on your mind. I decided to keep going with my rounds, trying to shake the eerie feeling, but every time I passed a room she had been in, I noticed the patients seemed agitated. The ones who had been stable were now restless, some mumbling incoherently, others lying there with a vacant look in their eyes. One of them, an elderly man in room 305, was shaking, his face pale. She touched me," he whispered. "I can feel it. She took something from me." I quickly checked his vitals. Everything seemed normal, but the fear in his eyes was real. He refused to talk any further, just turned away, muttering to himself. I decided to ask my coworker Tim about her. He'd been at the hospital longer than me. "Hey Tim, do you know anything about a new nurse working tonight? Pale, white uniform, looks like she's been here a long time." Tim gave me a puzzled look. "What are you talking about? There's no new nurse tonight. Just us and Jane on the other end of the floor." I felt a cold rush through my body. That couldn't be right. I had seen her. I decided to check with Jane, who was stationed at the nurse's desk further down the hall. "Hey Jane, did you see a nurse around here in a white uniform earlier?" She was near 307. Jane looked up from her paperwork, frowning. "What are you talking about? I've been here the whole time and no one's come through." Her voice was sharp, but it was the concern in her eyes that made my heart race. I felt like I was losing my mind. How could they not see her? To calm myself down, I went to the security desk on the first floor, hoping the camera footage would confirm I wasn't imagining things. I told the guard about the nurse and asked him to pull up the footage for the third floor hallway. As the footage played, I watched myself walking down the hallway, but something was wrong. I couldn't see her. The camera didn't capture her at all. I watched the spot where I had seen her clearly standing, but in the footage there was nothing but an empty hallway. My heart started pounding in my chest. I told the security guard to rewind the footage and slow it down. As we zoomed in, we both saw something I'll never forget. For a fraction of a second, her figure appeared on screen, but it wasn't right. Her image was distorted, like a glitch, flickering in and out of existence. And the worst part? Her face looked twisted, her smile stretched unnaturally wide, her eyes black holes. I ran back to the third floor, my pulse racing. Something was terribly wrong. As I turned the corner to the patient rooms, I saw 3 nurses gathered around room 307. I pushed past them and froze when I saw what had happened. The patient inside, a woman in her 60s who had been stable, was dead. Her face was frozen in an expression of terror, her hands gripping the sheets so tightly that her knuckles were white. The monitors were flatlined. Just then I noticed her chart. Time of death, 12:15 a.m., the exact time I had seen that nurse walk into her room. As the nurses started the paperwork, I felt nauseous. I had seen that nurse walk in. She was there. I stepped outside the room, my mind spinning. That's when I saw her again, standing at the far end of the hallway, staring right at me with that unnatural smile. I couldn't move. She slowly started walking toward me, her footsteps silent, her pale face illuminated by the dim hospital lights. She stopped a few feet away from me and whispered, "You're next." My throat went dry. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air too thick to breathe. Her cold, hollow eyes bored into mine for what felt like an eternity. And then she turned and disappeared into the shadows. I must have passed out because the next thing I remember was waking up in a hospital bed. The doctor said I had collapsed from exhaustion. But I know what I saw. It's been months now, but the feeling hasn't gone away. Every time I walk past that floor, I feel her presence. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, just for a second. And I know one night, when the halls are quiet and the lights flicker, I'll wake up and find her standing over me, with that same haunting smile. Being an EMT, I've seen my fair share of disturbing things. Car crashes, shootings, overdoses, nothing surprises me anymore. Or at least that's what I used to think. But one night on a call, everything I thought I knew about fear changed forever. It started as a regular shift, nothing out of the ordinary. We got a dispatch call around 2 a.m. to a private hospital on the outskirts of town. This hospital had always seemed a bit strange to me. It was small and old, tucked away from the city, almost forgotten. I'd been there once or twice before for minor calls, but something about it never sat right with me. It always felt like it was stuck in the past. The call was for a single patient, a woman in her 40s who had suddenly become violent. The nurse on the phone sounded frantic. "She's out of control," she said. "We can't sedate her and she's scaring the other patients." I remember the tension in her voice. This didn't feel like the usual patient outburst. But we were trained to handle difficult situations, so we didn't think much of it. We hopped in the ambulance and headed over. When we arrived, the hospital was deathly quiet. No cars in the parking lot, no signs of life. It was odd, considering it was supposed to be an operational facility. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Faded paint, flickering lights, and an eerie stillness. The air smelled of antiseptic, but it was mixed with something else. Something musty and stale, like the place hadn't been properly cleaned in years. We stepped inside and were greeted by a nurse at the front desk. She looked pale, her hands shaking as she handed me the chart. "Room 12, she muttered without making eye contact. There was something about her that felt off. She wouldn't look at us directly, and her uniform seemed old, just like the building. I glanced at my partner, who raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. As we made our way down the narrow hallway, the lights started flickering. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hallway was empty, no doctors, no other staff, no patients. Just us. My footsteps echoed loudly against the cold, tiled floor. We reached room 12 and I immediately felt a chill. The door was ajar and from inside, I could hear muttering, a low, raspy voice. My hand was trembling slightly as I pushed the door open. What I saw inside made me stop dead in my tracks. The woman was strapped to the bed, but not with the usual restraints. Thick, heavy chains bound her arms and legs, securing her tightly to the bed frame. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, with dark circles beneath them. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and she was muttering in a language I didn't recognize. Her eyes darted around the room, wild and terrified, but when they landed on me, she stopped speaking and stared directly at me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, they're not real. They're not doctors. They're the ones who did this to me." A cold sweat dripped down my back. I looked around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. There were 2 nurses and a doctor standing at the foot of her bed, but they weren't moving. They were just staring at her, emotionless, as if they were in a trance. Their eyes were empty, their faces expressionless. I turned to my partner. "What the hell is going on here?" I whispered. He didn't answer, just kept staring at the woman, his face pale. The nurse who had greeted us earlier appeared behind me, holding a syringe. "You need to sedate her," she said flatly, thrusting the needle into my hand. I hesitated, looking at the woman in the bed. She was trembling, her eyes wide with terror. "Please, don't," she begged. "They'll kill me if you do. They'll take me away." My hands were shaking now. Something wasn't right. This wasn't normal. I'd seen patients freak out before, but this felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was telling the truth. I stepped closer to her, syringe in hand, but as I approached, the lights flickered again, and for a brief moment the entire room went dark. I heard a blood-curdling scream that didn't sound human. When the lights flickered back on, the woman was gone. The chains lay empty on the bed, the restraints still locked, but she wasn't there. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my eyes darting around the room. My partner and the hospital staff were lying unconscious on the floor. The syringe fell from my hand, clattering against the tile. I rushed over to my partner, shaking him awake. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and confused. "What happened?" he muttered, rubbing his head. I don't know," I stammered, my voice shaky. I glanced at the nurses and doctor who had been in the room with us. They were still out cold, their faces expressionless, almost like they were in a coma. I bolted out of the room, dragging my partner behind me. The hallway seemed even darker now, and the walls felt like they were closing in. As we sprinted toward the exit, I glanced over my shoulder and saw a figure standing at the end of the hall. The woman. She was watching us, her eyes wide and filled with terror. But this time she wasn't strapped down. She was free, standing there in her hospital gown, staring at me. "You should have listened," she whispered, though her voice echoed all around me. I turned back toward the exit, pushing through the doors and collapsing outside, gasping for air. My partner was shaking, his face pale as a ghost. What the hell just happened?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. When we got back to the station we filed the report, but something felt off. I decided to call the hospital to follow up on the woman's status. I needed to know if she had been found, if she was okay. But when I asked the operator for the patient's details, they told me there was no record of any woman admitted that night. Confused, I double-checked the address. "The hospital," I said. "You know, the one on the outskirts of town?" The operator paused for a long moment. "Sir, that hospital has been closed for over 20 years. My heart dropped. That couldn't be right. I was just there. I saw the building. I saw the staff. I saw the woman. I hung up the phone and checked the charts again. My partner and I drove back out to the location the next night, just to confirm what we had seen. When we got there, the building was boarded up, covered in vines and decay, like it hadn't been touched in decades. There were no signs of life, no lights, no staff. It was just an empty, forgotten building. I still see her sometimes. When I close my eyes, I see her standing at the end of that hallway, staring at me with those wide, terrified eyes. I don't know what happened that night, but something followed me. Every now and then, I hear her voice whispering in the dark, "You should have listened." And every time I hear it, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't. I'm not someone who scares easily. Working as a night shift nurse in the emergency room for nearly 10 years, I've seen things most people wouldn't believe. Blood, trauma, death, I've handled it all. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, places where you're meant to feel safe. But there's one night, one shift, that still haunts me to this day. It was a Friday night and we were understaffed as usual. The hospital was buzzing with the usual chaos. Patients wheeled in on stretchers, the sound of heart monitors beeping, nurses rushing back and forth. But what stood out that night was the storm. A massive thunderstorm had rolled in around midnight, knocking out the power for a few minutes before the backup generators kicked in. The lights flickered and the hospital felt colder, darker than usual. I was assigned to the West Wing that night, a section of the hospital that rarely saw much action. It was the old wing, mostly empty except for a few long-term patients who needed constant care. The rest of the rooms were closed off, empty and unused for years. The place always gave me the creeps. It was quieter than the rest of the hospital, almost too quiet. Around 1 a.m., I received a call to check on a patient in room 304, an older man who had been recovering from surgery. He was a regular, always polite, always quiet. But something about him that night was different. When I entered his room, the air felt heavy. He was lying in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. His skin looked pale, almost ghostly. "Mr. Harlow?" I said softly as I approached his bedside. "Are you feeling okay?" He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, his breathing shallow. I reached out to check his pulse, and that's when he grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for someone in his condition. "Don't let them take me," he whispered, his voice trembling. His eyes finally met mine and I saw pure terror in them. "Who, Mr. Harlow? Who's trying to take you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "They're here," he whispered, his grip tightening on my wrist. "They come at night. They're not human. Please don't let them take me." I tried to reassure him, chalking it up to post-surgery delirium. Patients often became confused or frightened after waking up from anesthesia, especially older ones. But as I tried to pull away, he wouldn't let go. "They're here," he repeated, his voice now a frantic whisper. "In the walls. In the dark. Don't let them in." Chills ran down my spine. His eyes darted toward the corner of the room and for a split second, I swore I saw something, a shadow darker than the room itself, move across the wall. I blinked and it was gone. I managed to free my wrist and promised Mr. Harlow I'd stay close. I adjusted his IV and stepped out into the hallway, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dim lighting. But the hallway was eerily quiet. The storm outside was raging, but inside the West Wing, all I could hear was the faint hum of the hospital's generators. I walked back to the nurse's station, but something felt off. The hallways seemed darker than they should have been. The emergency lighting wasn't doing much to push back the shadows. I felt like I was being watched, but when I looked over my shoulder there was no one there. Around 2 a.m. I got another call, this time from room 306, just a few doors down from Mr. Harlow's room. I checked the chart, it was empty. That room hadn't been occupied in months. I thought maybe it was a glitch in the system, but the call light was on, flashing on the nurse's board, signaling someone had pressed the call button inside the room. Confused, I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check it out. The hallways were darker now, and the storm outside was growing louder, the thunder rumbling through the walls. When I reached room 306, the door was slightly ajar, but the room was pitch black. "Hello?" I called out, pushing the door open. "Is anyone in here?" There was no response. I shone my flashlight around the room, illuminating the bed, the empty chairs, the equipment. The room was exactly how I expected. Empty. No sign of anyone. But as I turned to leave, the door suddenly slammed shut behind me. I jumped, my heart racing as I tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lights in the room flickered, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Then I heard it. Breathing. Ragged, shallow breathing coming from the corner of the room. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, thin, pale and hunched, was standing in the corner, its back facing me. It wasn't moving, just standing there, breathing. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure slowly began to turn toward me, but before I could see its face, the lights flickered again and it was gone. Just like that, the room was empty again. I fumbled for the door, finally managing to pry it open and bolted out into the hallway. I could barely catch my breath as I ran back to the nurse's station, but when I arrived, something was wrong. The entire West Wing was dark, not a single light on. The power had gone out again and I was completely alone. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. My heart was racing and all I could think about was getting out of there. But then I remembered Mr. Harlow. I couldn't leave him alone. Not after what he had said. I rushed back to room 304, but when I got there, the bed was empty. The sheets were pulled back and the room was completely still. It was as if Mr. Harlow had vanished into thin air. I checked the bathroom, the closet, even under the bed, but there was no sign of him. That's when I noticed something, scratch marks on the floor leading from the bed to the door. My heart pounded as I followed the marks into the hallway, which led to another door at the end of the hall, a door that I had never noticed before. It was small, almost hidden, with no markings or signs. I approached it cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated, but something, whether it was curiosity or fear, compelled me to descend the stairs. As I reached the bottom, I found myself in a room that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Old medical equipment lay scattered around, covered in dust, and the air was damp and cold. And then I saw them. Rows of beds, lined up against the walls, each one occupied by a patient. But these weren't ordinary patients. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, their eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Their bodies were motionless, but I could hear faint breathing, the same ragged breaths I had heard in room 306. In the center of the room was Mr. Harlow, lying on a gurney, his eyes wide with terror, just like the others. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They've always been here." Before I could react, the lights flickered one last time and everything went dark. The next thing I remember, I was waking up in a hospital bed in the ER. My coworkers told me they had found me passed out in the West Wing, but when I asked about Mr. Harlow, they looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no patient by that name," they said. "Room 304 hasn't been occupied in years." I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. They told me it was just a hallucination, a result of stress and exhaustion. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. To this day, I avoid the West Wing. I've asked around, but no one can explain why that part of the hospital was shut down or what happened to the patients who were there. But every night, when the lights flicker, I hear them. The breathing. The whispers. And I know they're still there waiting.